As the 1960s evolved into the 1970s, it became time for Lincoln to introduce a new full-size vehicle in its lineup. The result was the 1970 Lincoln Continental that you see here. This vehicle marked a significant departure from the previous generation Continental that it replaced, and which ran from the 1961 to 1969 model years. Aside from major differences in styling, the chassis of the 1970 Continental was also materially different in that it reverted back to a body-on-frame design from the former unibody design of the 61 to 69 Continental and even the 58 to 60 Continentals. The 1970 Continental styling would remain relatively the same to the 1974 model year, although various styling elements did indeed change. However, for 1975 and after 5 model years on the market, Lincoln made an extensive revision to the Continental styling, which coincided with Mercury also changing its styling quite significantly for its marquee. Well, the sheet metal below the belt line remained relatively similar to the 1970 to 74 models, and the chassis also remained quite similar. The roofline was materially different on the 1975 Continental versus the previous versions, having a more upright and boxy appearance versus the 70 to 74 models. The grille on the 75 Continental was also redesigned, and despite the fact that Lincoln was trying to differentiate the vehicle a bit more from Mercury, the grille on this 1975 Continental most certainly resembles a grille that also found itself in the 1975 Mercury Marquis lineup. And while some may deem the styling changes of the 1975 model over the 1974 as a bit more frumpy and perhaps a bit of a throwback to the past, the truth is that the sales of the 1975 Continental far exceeded that of the 1974 model year, with about 55,000 units being sold in 1975 versus about 36,000 units being sold in 1974. The car also grew in overall length, and while the wheelbase was still 127 inches, the overall vehicle was now measuring about 233 inches in length. Not quite the longest non-limousine production car ever produced. That award goes to the 1973 Chrysler Imperial, that measured 235 inches in overall length, but it was certainly one of the largest cars of the time period. And by the 1977 model year, the Continental sales were picking up even greater steam versus the 1975 model year, with almost 100,000 units sold in 1977, and of those, about 70,000 were sedans similar to this four-door shown here. I guess the buying public really liked the so-called presence of the vehicle that this car certainly has. Now, by 1977, a number of styling revisions had been made. Most prominently is the Rolls-Royce style grille with the vertical theme you can see up front there. The grille had evolved from that 1975 version that had quite a bit in common with Mercury to this more formal English style, shall we call it, grille. And you can see here that the rear of the car continued with the rectilinear theme that you could see in the front, with almost a continuous unbroken line from the front fender tip all the way back to the quarter panel, albeit with a little bit of a beltline kick-up at the sail panel near the opera window. The other thing that you can see in this photo is the extremely large, quote-unquote, hang-on bumpers that resulted from the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard that was implemented for the 1974 model year in both the front and back of these vehicles. Ford had this interesting way of achieving that, different from General Motors, where significant portions of the overall feature lines and forms of the vehicle were made out of rubber. Here, Ford just put a bumper about 3 inches proud of the overall sheet metal and had this rubber flubber extension filler in between it. It doesn't quite look as elegant, and to be honest, I think Chrysler actually did the 5-mile-an-hour mandated bumpers in the most elegant fashion versus General Motors and Ford. Turning to the interior, 1977 would mark a very distinct model year for the Continental in that it was the last year that this dashboard theme would be employed for the vehicle. This dashboard theme had been introduced in the 1970 model year, and it started out with kind of an inverted racetrack theme where the faux wood grain would wrap all the way from the lower portion of the IEP up through the speedometer area and back down over the passenger side. By the 1977 model year, you can see that inverted racetrack theme is now gone, And in its place, some faux wood grain has been added around the gauges and the wiper and light controls, as well as the climate controls that are to the right of the steering wheel. After the 1977 model year, these Lincolns would get a dashboard that was shared with Mercury, and part of that was due to cost savings objectives, but the other part of it was due to weight, as the Mercury dashboard was simply lighter. So this would be the last year for the rolling drum speedometer Continental IP. And you can also see that this vehicle has an optional feature that smokers loved, and that's the mini vent windows. Notice the little divider bar there between the front of the door glass pane and the back. When you operated the power window, that portion of the glass would go down first before the larger portion of the glass would go down, and that divider was not fixed. It was actually part of the front glass. On later Continentals, probably because of the reliability issues associated with this, that divider bar would become fixed. But on these, it actually moves with the front glass plane. And as we pull out here, you can see the divider bar even better for the mini vent window. But you can also take a look at this particular town car trim's beautiful velour seating areas. These seats have a so-called loose cushion look. It kind of looks like there's a pillow there on your sofa that you could just remove, but this was obviously sewn into the seat. And this loose cushion look would become very popular in the 1970s. One of the first cars to have it was the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency. And in the same model year, the 1972 Imperial had a bit similar of a theme, although the Imperials and the 1972 Regency interiors were both inspired by the Barcelona chair. Here, that Barcelona chair influence is not really present at all. And turning under hood in this particular Continental, we have the penultimate year for the 460 cubic inch V8 here, now making 208 horsepower in the 1977 model year. 1978 would be the last year for the 460 in these Continentals and also the Mark Series vehicles. And a buyer would have to make do with just a 400 cubic inch engine with a two-barrel V8, motivating almost 5,000 pounds of weight for the 1979 model year. In the 1977 model year, the 400 cubic inch V8 made 179 horsepower. So the 460 was not overly powerful by this point. It had been choked down with significant amounts of smog and emissions items. You can see quite a few pieces of vacuum hose there. And also notice the high-C juice cans on either side for vacuum reservoir tanks for the headlight system and the climate control system. And you can't quite see it here because the antifreeze overflow bottle is obstructing the view. But the keen observer will note a General Motors A6 style Frigidaire air conditioning compressor on this vehicle. Lincoln had switched to General Motors air conditioning systems in their vehicles in the 1972 model year, in part because the two-piston York compressors that they were using just couldn't perform as well as the General Motors systems. So if you ever want to egg a Ford fan on and you're a General Motors fan, just remind them that quite a few of these upper-end vehicles, and actually by this point, quite a few Ford vehicles overall, had this General Motors style air conditioning system because of its overall capacity was much greater than what Ford was using previously. You can also spot on the top of the fender on the driver's side the ignition control box, which, if you want a tip for when it's about to go bad, see if it starts leaking resin out the bottom. That's what often tends to happen before they fail. Last but not least is also GM Saginaw power steering pump under hood here. So I guess Lincoln had an affinity for General Motors items in some cases. So what's it like to own one of these 1975 to 1979 Continentals? Well, I can say that I honestly prefer of the 1970 to 79 generation, the 1970 and 71 model years the most, in part because of the styling and also in part because those are the only years where they have the high compression 460 cubic inch engine. It really has quite a bit of scoot for these big vehicles. By the 1972 model year, the high compression 460 had gone away, and horsepower was considerably down into the low 200s in that 1972 model year. But I will also say that the early 1970s versions of these vehicles just seem to be heavier and more well-built in some cases than the 1975 to 79 generation, in part because Ford was starting to take out costs from the vehicles and also trying to lighten them. So my personal opinion is that the 75 through 79 model years don't quite drive as nicely as the earlier model years of this particular Continental. One other word of caution to individuals who are looking to buy a 1975 to 79 Continental is that by that time period, the headlamp actuators that Ford was using were really not made of high quality pot metal, and they consequently corrode from the inside. So if you're looking to buy one of these vehicles, make sure that after you shut the car off that the headlight doors stay closed, preferably for a day or two before they start to pop open. If you notice that they pop open almost immediately after the car is shut off, they're bad, and it's very, very hard to find replacements to those headlamp actuators, and really almost nobody rebuilds them. And if they do rebuild them, they'll charge you $800 to $1,000 to redo them. In any case, hope you enjoyed the spotlight on the 1977 Continental. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.